From the stone piers of a Roman bridge to the steel cranes of a modern riverfront, the story of Newcastle upon Tyne spans nearly 2 millennia of continuous occupation on the north bank of the River Tyne. What began as Pons Aelius, a military crossing on the edge of the Roman world, evolved through Saxon monastery, Norman fortress and medieval coal port into one of Britain's foremost industrial cities, then transformed again in the wake of that industry's collapse. The images throughout this video are reconstructions generated with the assistance of artificial intelligence, interpretive visualizations of a past that survives only in fragmentary archaeological evidence, manuscript descriptions, and the occasional engraving. Small inconsistencies may appear, but these tools allow us to glimpse streetscapes and structures otherwise lost to time, rendering visible the physical environments that shaped 2,000 years of habitation at this strategic crossing point. From the fortified bridgehead of Hadrian's wall, through the coal monopolies that built a merchant oligarchy, from the shipyards that launched vessels for every ocean, to the cultural renaissance of a post-industrial city, this is the documented history of Newcastle upon Tyne, a chronicle of how geography, warfare, commerce and reinvention wrote themselves into the fabric of England's northern gateway. In the year 122, the Emperor Hadrian's surveyors chose this crossing for strategic reasons that would shape the site for centuries. Here, where the river narrowed between sandstone banks, Roman engineers raised the fort of Pons Aelius and its stone bridge, the name honouring the emperor's family and suggesting he walked these northern ramparts during his tour of Britannia. Contemporary garrison records indicate a population approaching 2,000 souls, comprised of auxiliary troops drawn from across the empire and the civilian settlement that clustered inevitably beyond the fort gates. Archaeological evidence shows the stone piers carried traffic until the empire's final decades, when the legions withdrew and left the bridge to crumble into the Tyne's dark current. The wall itself ran 73 miles to the western sea, its eastern terminus at Sege do Num, in what would become Wild's End, 3 miles downriver. Excavations have revealed the parallel earthworks of the Vallum, the deep defensive ditch flanked by turf mounds that ceased west of this crossing, where the river's width rendered such labour redundant. Fragments of the wall survive today along the modern West Road, their weathered stones bearing witness to a frontier that once divided the known world from the Pictish territories beyond. After the Empire's departure in 410, the crossing became Mune UK Caster, documented in later sources as Monk Chester, a name suggesting the monastic settlement that grew within the ruins of the Roman fort during Northumbria's Christian centuries. The Venerable Bede, writing his Historia Ecclesiastica from the monastery at Jarrow, scarcely 3 miles east in 731, makes no direct mention of the site, though his chronicle records the kingdom's broader patterns. Danish raiders swept the Tyne Valley in 876, and chroniclers describe settlements along the river reduced to charred timber and empty stone. The crossing fell into a silence that lasted centuries, broken only by seasonal fishermen and the bells from Jarrow drifting across the marshes at vespers. When the Normans came in 1066, they found little worth the taking. The 1088 rebellion against William's half-brother O.H. of Bayeux brought swift destruction to what remained, leaving the site a scatter of Roman masonry overgrown with bramble and elder, awaiting the castle that would give it a new name. The wooden fortress that Robert Curthose raised above the Tyne crossing in 1080 gave the settlement its enduring name, transforming Monk Chester into the Novum Castellum that would anchor England's northern defence for centuries. Contemporary chronicles describe the earthwork and timber structure as formidable by the standards of early Norman occupation, commanding both the Roman bridge site and the river approaches from a sandstone outcrop that had served military purposes since Hadrian's engineers first surveyed this ground. Within 7 years, stone replaced timber, and by 1172, when Henry II ordered a comprehensive rebuilding, the Great Square Keep rose to dominate the townscape in a form that archaeological evidence shows remained largely unchanged through successive medieval campaigns. The town that grew beneath these walls developed as both garrison and market, its streets arranged around the castle precincts and the quayside where wool merchants conducted trade that increasingly drew Hanseatic interest from across the North Sea. Records from the 13th century document Newcastle's expanding role in the wool trade, linking the northern counties with continental markets, particularly through connections with Berwick, before that port's fortunes shifted with the Scottish Wars. The defensive circuit erected between 1265 and 1370 enclosed 2 miles of urban fabric behind walls that contemporary accounts describe as standing 25 feet high, punctuated by towers and gates through which all commerce and movement necessarily passed. The fortress repeatedly fulfilled its strategic purpose throughout the 14th century, successfully repelling Scottish assaults on 3 documented occasions, while serving as the staging ground for English campaigns northward. Edward I brought the Stone of Scone through these gates in 1296, and 9 years later the captured William Wallace passed beneath the castle on his final journey south to execution in London. Yet the same century brought afflictions that stone walls could not resist. The pestilence of 1349 reached Newcastle by summer, and burial records indicate mortality approaching 1/3 of the urban population before the contagion ran its course through the crowded streets within the defensive circuit. The town that emerged from plague years found its status elevated in 1400, when Henry IV granted Newcastle separation from Northumberland's county administration, establishing it as a corporate entity with jurisdictions and privileges that would shape its governance through the Tudor age. The monopoly that would define Newcastle for 2 centuries began with a Royal Act in 1530, restricting all coal shipments from the Tyneside region to the city's quayside alone. Within a generation, the phrase "carrying coals to Newcastle" had entered the language as shorthand for pointless endeavour, testament to how thoroughly the black mineral had become synonymous with the city. By the early 17th century, a quarter of all British coal exports passed through the Tyne, controlled by a tight cartel of merchant burgesses known as the Hostmen, who regulated every aspect of the trade from pit to port. The coal itself travelled a distinctive route to market, for the mines lay upstream along the river valleys, whilst the ocean-going colliers anchored downstream at Shields. Contemporary accounts describe the fleet of keels that bridged this gap, shallow drafted boats manned by close-knit crews working from the Sandgate district. These keelmen formed their own community apart from the broader population, their labour essential to the prosperity that transformed Newcastle's townscape throughout the Tudor and Stuart periods. The river chroniclers of the era consistently noted the procession of loaded keels moving with the tide, black dust settling on the water's surface as the cargo shifted. Elizabeth I granted the city a new charter in 1589, formal recognition of its commercial importance to the realm. Yet prosperity brought vulnerability, as became evident when plague reached Newcastle in the 1630s. Records from the Society of Antiquaries indicate that the outbreak of 1636 claimed approximately 47% of the population, some 7,000 souls, from a city of 20,000. The disease spread swiftly through the crowded wynds and chairs that climbed the steep banks above the quayside. The English Civil War brought a different threat, when Newcastle's royalist sympathies made it a strategic prize for parliamentary forces seeking to control the northern coal supply. After a prolonged siege in 1644, Cromwell's Scottish allies stormed the defences with what contemporary accounts describe as roaring drums, then sacked the city thoroughly. The grateful King Charles bestowed the motto Fortiter Defendit Triumphans upon the town for its resistance, though he himself would be imprisoned here by the Scots 2 years later, confined whilst his fate was negotiated with the English Parliament. The Restoration brought renewed prosperity and urban expansion, with the development of formal market spaces including the Big Market and Cloth Market that still bear their 17th century names. Archaeological evidence from this period shows substantial rebuilding in stone, replacing the timber structures that had dominated the medieval streetscape. If this reconstruction of Newcastle's coal era past resonates with you, consider becoming a channel member. Your support enables these visual journeys through lost cities to continue. Now the 18th century beckons. The Union of 1707 dissolved Newcastle's military frontier but opened a commercial one. Within half a century, the coal trade that had enriched medieval merchants began transforming into something industrial historians would recognise as modern mechanised production. The riverside workshops multiplied, documented in tax rolls that recorded the expansion from 40 registered forges in 1750 to more than 200 by 1800, each dependent upon the coal seams running beneath the northern bank. George Stephenson was born in 1781 at Wylam, 9 miles upriver, in a single-room cottage beside the colliery Wagon Way. Contemporary accounts describe the rhythmic clatter of wooden wheels on iron rails as the constant backdrop to childhood in the industrial villages strung along the Tyne. By 1814, working as engine wright at Killingworth Colliery, Stephenson completed Blucher, a steam locomotive capable of hauling 30 tons at 4 miles per hour. 15 years later, his rocket demonstrated at the Rainhill trials what reliable steam traction could achieve, establishing the template for railway expansion across 4 continents. The transformation accelerated through the decades that followed. William Armstrong arrived in Newcastle in 1847 and established the Elswick Works on a 6-acre plot west of the city centre. Within 30 years, archaeological surveys of the site reveal an industrial complex stretching across 300 acres, employing more than 20,000 workers in the manufacture of hydraulic machinery, artillery pieces and warships. Visitors to Armstrong's private residence at Craigside in 1880 remarked upon the incandescent lamps illuminating the gallery, the first domestic installation powered by hydroelectricity anywhere in the world. The Tyne itself became a linear factory. Swan Hunter opened its Wallsend yard in 1880, Hawthorne Leslie expanded in Hebburn, Vickers established works downstream at Elswick. Registry records from the Board of Trade document the tonnage launched each year from the river's shipyards, rising from 40,000 tons in 1850 to 300,000 by 1900. The vessels constructed here carried British commerce and naval power to every ocean, each hull plate hammered and riveted by hand within earshot of the city centre. Newcastle's population reached 200,000 by the century's end, housed in terraced rows that climbed the steep banks away from the industrial riverside. The construction of the Tyne Bridge, begun in 1925 and opened in 1928, created the graceful steel arch that would serve as template for Sydney Harbour Bridge 4 years later. Contemporary photographs show the completed structure rising above a riverscape dense with cranes, gantries and the smoking funnels of works that had made Newcastle synonymous with industrial Britain. The launch of the Mauretania in 1906 from Swan Hunter's yard marked the zenith of Tyneside's shipbuilding ambition, a 20,000-ton liner that would hold the blue riband for 22 consecutive years, her name spoken across the Atlantic routes as synonymous with speed and elegance. Within a year, the same yard delivered Carpathia, whose fame came in darker circumstance when she steamed through the North Atlantic night to rescue survivors from Titanic's sinking. Contemporary engineering journals described the scale of these launches, the timber staging that held each hull, the chains capable of bearing 30 tons apiece, the hydraulic rams that eased 20,000 tons into the river without catastrophe. The Great War transformed the yards into round-the-clock arsenals. Dreadnoughts grew on slipways lit by arc lamps through winter nights, whilst riveters worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. Records show that between 1914 and 1918 the Tyne delivered more tonnage of naval vessels than any other British river, a production sustained by 24-hour work patterns that left entire neighbourhoods sleeping in shifts. The peace brought unemployment that deepened through the 20s into outright collapse. In October 1936, 200 men from Jarrow, 8 miles downriver, marched 300 miles to London, their petition carried at the front of the column. Newspaper accounts described the route they walked through autumn rain, seeking work in a town where the shipyard had closed and 70% of the workforce stood idle. Newcastle watched them pass, familiar with the arithmetic of decline. Air raids during World War II caused 141 deaths and 587 injuries in Newcastle, concentrated in districts closest to the industrial riverfront. The yard survived and reached their final peak in the early 1960s when Tyneside ranked second globally for tonnage launched, then fell with shocking speed before containerization and Asian competition. Swan Hunter's gates closed for the final time in 1988, ending 8 centuries of continuous maritime industry on the Tyne. Archaeological surveys of the former yards reveal foundations laid in the medieval period, beam slots cut for vessels whose names no record preserves, overlaid by the concrete plinths of 20th century cranes that would never turn again. The coalfields that had sustained Tyneside for 4 centuries came to their end in the spring of 1984 when the miners' strike began. For 12 months, the pits of Durham and Northumberland ceased production, not by market forces alone, but through a confrontation that left families divided and communities broken. By March 1985, when the strike collapsed, the closures accelerated. The headframes came down, the drift mines were sealed, and the underground galleries that hewers had worked since the 16th century flooded back to groundwater. Contemporary accounts describe entire valleys falling silent, the rhythm of shift changes and pithead whistles replaced by a stillness that felt, to those who remained, like bereavement. Unemployment in Newcastle reached 17% by the end of 1985. The shipyards that had survived into the 1970s now stood empty along both banks of the Tyne. Swan Hunter, Vickers Elswick, Hawthorne Leslie, their slipways cracked and overgrown, their workshops stripped by salvage crews. Photographs from the period show entire riverside stretches abandoned to rust and bramble, the great gantries skeletal against the northern sky. Thousands left the region during these years, bound for Australia and Canada, carrying skills that would rebuild shipyards and power stations on distant coasts, whilst the Tyne itself grew quieter each season. Through the 1990s, Newcastle became a national symbol of post-industrial decay. The river, still polluted from a century of chemical discharge and untreated sewage, ran brown beneath derelict wharves. Urban planners spoke of regeneration, but the evidence remained sparse. Boarded shopfronts in the city centre, housing estates built in the 1960s already crumbling, a skyline dominated by structures no one quite knew what to do with. Yet beneath this visible decline, quieter projects moved forward. In 1988, the borough of Gateshead commissioned a sculpture from the artist Anthony Gormley intended for a hillside site beside the A1 motorway south of the Tyne. Design work continued through 1994, though construction would not begin for several years. In May 1997, the election of Tony Blair's government brought renewed attention to the northeast, promises of investment filtering slowly into regional development offices. The Angel remained unbuilt, but its drawings circulated, a 20-metre steel figure, arms outstretched, gazing north across the coalfields that would not return. The same river that carried Hadrian's engineers upstream in 122 now reflects the weathered steel wingspan of the Angel of the North, raised in 1998 on a former colliery site south of the Tyne. Standing 20 metres tall, Anthony Gormley's sculpture has become the most photographed landmark in Britain after Big Ben, its outstretched arms greeting 200,000 motorists each day along the Great North Road. 4 years later, the Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art opened within a decommissioned grain warehouse on the southern quay, its stark industrial facade preserved whilst the interior was transformed into northern England's largest contemporary gallery. The Sage Gateshead followed in 2004, Norman Foster's glass and steel music venue curving beside the tilting Millennium Bridge, itself an engineering feat that would have impressed Armstrong's generation. The quayside where coal ships once queued, 10 deep, now hosts open-air concerts and international food markets. Newcastle University's Medical Research Cluster ranks second nationally, employing thousands in laboratories built over former shipyards. Yet the defining constant remains the Tyne, still dividing and connecting, still shaping the life of the city as it has done for 2 millennia. From Roman bridgehead to medieval fortress, from coal staithes to cultural quarter, the river endures.